Hey class, happy whatever today is. Today we're going to talk about social psychology, and by today, I mean I'm talking about it today. You're going to listen to it another day. So between those 2 days, we're gonna we're gonna talk about it. You'll hear about it. We've done this before. Why am I making it so difficult? Oh boy, it's social psychology. Okay, perfect. So first, let's talk about attributions. Attributions come in two forms, personal and situational. Personal attributions are things like, uh, oh, that person is really terrible, or oh, that person's really nice, or oh, that person's so talented. They're referring to the abilities, traits, moods, or efforts of a specific individual. Then we have situational attributions, which are referring to external events like weather, luck, and accidents. So let's say I am playing poker with a friend, and I'm like, man, my friend is really good at poker. That would be a personal attribution because I'm assuming that the reason why they're good is because that is just a quality about them. Now, a situational attribution would be something like somebody cuts me off on the highway, and I say, "Ugh, what a day they." I almost automatically said, "What a jerk." But if it were situational, then I would say, "Oh, they must be having a really rough day, right?" So instead of blaming them and saying that they're a horrible person, I'm attributing it to the situation. So when we're looking at behaviors of others, especially when it comes to negative or unwanted behaviors, we might make personal attributions. So, say that they're just a bad person, or situational attributions, understanding that the situation has an impact on the situation. So, when we are looking at other people, we might make what's called the fundamental attribution error, which is the idea to make attributions, personal attributions specifically, based off of the fact that it's just a person who is not us. So, for example, you're sitting in a classroom. Remember when we used to sit in classrooms? You're sitting in a classroom and uh, the bell's already rung. Bells don't ring in college. The class has already started, and 15 minutes later, a student walks in. Your first thought might be, wow, what's wrong with this person, right? It's 1 p.m. Did you sleep through the entire day? That would be a personal attribution. And that would be an example of the fundamental attribution error because we're not assuming the that the that there was terrible traffic or there was some work issue, which would be a you know a different thing. We are usually jumping to the idea that they're just a bad, lazy person, right? Now, when we are late to class, we're like, oh, traffic was terrible. Oh, my car was giving me issues, right? We're making situational attributions. That's the actor observer bias. So be aware that when we're looking at ourselves versus other people, we're going to make different attributions. Another example of this might be maybe doing a presentation, somebody stumbles over a word, and we're like, oh, uh, wow, you can't even pronounce that word. So dumb, which would be a very mean thing to say. So please don't be that person. But then when you're doing a presentation, right, instead of making the fundamental attribution error and making a personal attribution towards them, you stumble on a word and you're dealing with the actor observer bias, right? Oh, well, this material that I'm talking about is very difficult, right? So it's not that I'm bad at school. I'm just dealing with a very difficult subject. Now, this can also play a role when we're looking at groups. So we have what is called the in group and the out group. So let's say I'm a big Dodgers fan. Every time I see somebody with a Dodgers jersey, I go, LA forever. We are LA. Yes, 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 right? But the Angels, oh boy. I do not like the Angels. Every time I see somebody wearing an Angels cap, I just get angry, right? The in group are the groups that we associate with, right? So it could be Dodgers fans, it could be people who are students, it could be people from Los Angeles, right? People who went to the same school as us. We're part of multiple in groups. And then we have the out groups, which are just everybody opposite that. So you went to Citrus, which means that you're part of the Citrus in group. You find out that somebody went to Mount Sac, and then you go, ugh, those Mount Sac kids, right? So the in group is Citrus College students, the out group is Mount Sac. So when we're looking at the behavior of other people, we tend to make the personal attribution when we're dealing with out groups. So when the um, uh, when you're rooting for your team at a sports game, right? And the other team gets a point, you might say, "Oh, they're cheaters. You know, they're the worst. They're like it's not fair, right? You're making a personal attribution. Now, when something happens to your team, you're like, it's not that your team is bad. The issue is, oh, the balls were deflated, the refs being unfair, right? They have home court advantage. So uh, you're making a situational attribution when you're dealing with yourself and your group, right? You're making a personal attribution when it comes to them. This, you might be wondering why I am using a sports metaphor. Maybe you don't care, but this is the root of racism and prejudice, right? So we have people who we identify as us, and we have people who we identify as them, right? Or if you look at politics, two politicians do the exact same crime, right? Maybe they were embezzling funds. So let's say I were a Democrat, and then I see a Republican embezzling funds, and then I would say something to the effect of, hey, all Republicans are bad. Look, that Republican is embezzling funds, right? They're all bad. They're all evil. I'm making a personal attribution. But then a Democrat embezzles funds, and then I say, well, they were maybe very stressed. They have to provide for their family. They didn't know better, right? I'm not saying that they're bad. I'm saying it's a situation that is causing their circumstances. So we have to be very careful when we're making these attributions, because it can be a huge blindside for us, where we're more likely to forgive somebody for something and allow it to happen just because they're part of the same group that we are. Or we are much more likely to be harder on other people because they're part of the identified out group. So here's something fun. It's called the self-fulfilling prophecy, and I think it's really important to understand this. You might have heard terms like mind over matter. You might have heard of the secret, right? The ability to kind of manifest things into existence. Now, from a psychological perspective and from a scientific perspective, that isn't something that we would necessarily give credence to. We wouldn't say like that is a thing that we wouldn't say, oh, well, there's scientific proof of the secret. But this is as close as it gets from a scientific perspective. And once we get into it, you'll see how much it makes sense. So let's say you are going into a job interview and you're feeling like there's a chance that you won't get it, right? So you go in, you kind of are like, oh, they probably made up their mind already. They're doing this as a formality. And you go in and you just do a pretty good interview, right? You don't really stand out, but you do an interview, answer the questions, you do okay. Now, In another scenario, you feel confident that you're going to get the job. In your mind, you already know that you've got the job, right? So you walk in, you're confident, you're yourself, right? You make them laugh if you're a funny person. You impress them with your skills. And so if you if you do an interview with the confidence of already having gotten it, you're probably going to do better than if you're pulling back and not doing your best work. So the idea of manifesting isn't just creating anything from nothing, but it's shaping how other people perceive you based off of your actions, right? Same with asking somebody out on a date. If you ask somebody out confidently versus asking someone out nervously, you're more likely to get somebody to like respond to you, right? In a positive manner. So, really, we do have the ability to create our own kind of realities in some way because our beliefs about what is going to happen affect what will happen. You might have heard that when it comes to terminal illnesses or risky surgery or things like that, people who have a generally positive outlook tend to live longer. People who have a negative outlook on life tend to live shorter lives. And part of that, weirdly enough, is just the positivity and how that affects your other behaviors. So let's just say you're optimistic, right? If you're optimistic, you're more likely to comply with medicine. You're more likely to be less stressed, which allows your body to do the work that it needs to do, right? So, really understanding the self fulfilling prophecy, our tendency to create our own realities based off of our assumptions about what's going to happen is really powerful because once you realize how much you get in your own way about things, you learn all I have to do is trust that I'm going to be okay, and more than likely, I will be okay. So, when we talk about social psychology, we have to talk about prejudice and discrimination. Uh, the it's a constant conversation around the world about how can we be better, and a lot of these things, as you'll see, are deeply rooted because we naturally distrust, we naturally judge people who we identify as different than us, right? So let's talk about some of these terms. Prejudices are negative feelings or thoughts or beliefs about a person or group. So, all uh, people with, glasses are really perverted, right? Like, ooh, gross. That person with glasses, ooh, right? That would be a negative feeling, right? Discrimination would be the behavior, right? So you're swiping on a dating app and then you see somebody wearing glasses and you're like, oh, I don't want to just hear a whole bunch of like really gross jokes because all people with glasses always make really gross jokes, right? So you're discriminating based off of that prejudice. Or maybe you have a prejudice that people who have darker skin are more dangerous. So maybe you're a store owner, and then somebody with darker skin comes in, and then you refuse to serve them. That would be discrimination because of their darker skin. So prejudices are the thoughts, discrimination is the behavior. Now, your book uses the term modern racism, which I think is a really useful term to understand because we tend to think of prejudice and discrimination as very overt sometimes. So, like, racism has to be somebody like yelling a racial slur and like threatening your life. When a lot of times it's very subtle. There are things called microaggressions, which are things that uh, on the surface sometimes don't seem super harmful, but are kind of just reinforcing the power structure of racism or sexism, ageism, homophobia, transphobia. etc. Right? So the uh, so I might not say, well, I don't like black people, but I might make a lot of black jokes in the workplace, right? I might say that I want to create a safe environment for women in the workplace, but every time there's a new female hire, I might say something like, wow, look at this gorgeous person walking in, when I don't do that to any of my male, colleagues, right? So and then I might say, well, it's a compliment. Why is it a big deal? Well, you're treating somebody differently based off of their gender or race, right? So modern racism, as we're often seeing, are just very subtle things that aren't very overt, but still perpetuate racist beliefs, right? So then we have sexism, prejudices, and discrimination based off of sex, ageism, prejudice and discrimination based on age, homophobia, prejudice and discrimination based off of sexual orientation, transphobia, prejudice and discrimination against transgender individuals. And I did not mention ableism, but it's prejudice and discrimination against people who might be considered disabled, right? So somebody is in a wheelchair and you're hiring them for a job, and then you go, well, they won't be able to do the job because they're in a wheelchair. Well, how do you know that? You're assuming, right? You have a prejudice, and then you're discriminating based off of that prejudice. So we have to be very aware of the thoughts that we have, the behaviors that we do, how those relate to one another, and by becoming aware, we can become better. So there's a phrase that you might have heard a few people saying, but it's essentially the idea, and this can apply to any of the isms or phobias, where it's not enough to be not racist. You have to be aggressively anti-racist, right? So there's a difference between saying, well, I'm not racist, right? Which means that I have not done any racist things, versus making sure that you're aware of that structure and that issue, and you're doing your best to make sure it's not an issue in school or in work, right? So the a, a great way of saying another way of thinking about it is uh, not being racist would be, I don't make this joke about this group of people, right? I'm not racist. I don't make jokes that put other people down. Being anti-racist would be not allowing those jokes to be told in the first place, right? Hey, maybe we shouldn't tell jokes about how blonde women are super dumb. Maybe that's offensive, right? And maybe it's an unfair stereotype. So really learning about these things and learning about how we can be better and how we can be more inclusive is really important. So let's talk about our attitudes. So we have the mere exposure effect, which is our tendency to like something based off the fact that you might have had a previous experience with it. So, for example, maybe you are going shopping, and the person who asks you to go buy pens is like, yeah, just buy me like one of those packs of pens. Now, there are a lot of brands of pens, and so the only recognizable brand that you see is Bic, and then you see some other brands that you've never heard of, right? Automatically, you're going to feel like you should buy the Bic pens because you've been exposed to them. You're more likely to like them and trust them just because you've seen them before. This is how commercials work essentially, right? If I show you 7 different Pizza Hut ads a week, then when you go to get pizza, and there are lots of places you can choose from, you could even go to like a small non-chain restaurant, but you think, well, I'm familiar with Pizza Hut, so I'm going to go get Pizza Hut, right? Unless your familiarity with Pizza Hut is terrible. When we can also look at explicit versus implicit attitudes. So these are things that are either easy to report, explicit, or very difficult to report, implicit. So let's say um, you're talking to a friend and you just recently introduced them to a mutual friend, right? So your friend says, I really didn't like them that much. And then you go, oh, really? What didn't you like about them? I don't know. They just didn't give me a really good vibe, right? I didn't really gel with them. I'm not sure what it is. That would be an implicit attitude. Now, if your friend said, yeah, I didn't like them. They were very rude and they cut me off a lot in the middle of the conversation. They also said like a lot of things that were kind of like just insulting, like they just kept on like putting me down. So yeah, I'm not really a huge fan of that person. That would be an explicit attitude because it's easy to report. Or think of food preferences, right? I'm not a huge fan of mashed potatoes. Feel free to hate me. Jump down in the comment section below. But when people ask me what don't you like about them, right? I can. It's very hard for me to say. I'm just like, well, no, it's not the texture, it's not the taste. They taste fine. I just don't want to eat them. So that would be an implicit attitude. Now, if somebody asked me, well, why don't you eat fish? I would be able to say, well, I'm allergic to it and I don't want to die, right? That's explicit. I can very easily say that I don't want to die, right? So the last thing that I want to talk about is cognitive dissonance, which is our tendency to justify our behaviors when our behaviors and our beliefs contradict each other. So let's say you are in a relationship, right? And the relationship is not working. What should you do? Uh, Hopefully, you're thinking, oh, move on from the relationship, right? In most cases, the best thing to do is move on. Now, why don't we? Well, our brains are really bad at making logical decisions, as you might have learned. So, what our brains do is we go, well, the logical thing to do is to leave the relationship. But I have these feelings that are positive, right? And I haven't left the relationship yet. So if I haven't left and I still have these positive feelings, then I guess that means that I shouldn't leave. So we're trying to justify the fact that our behaviors aren't matching what we're actually feeling, right? So we don't leave because we're like, well, if I wanted to leave, I would have left. But you want to leave. You're not doing it because you haven't done it. So there's this conflict between what you're doing and what you're feeling, right? Sometimes we see this in like the political world where the uh, so let's talk about like taxes. And we say, well, we can't give a lot of tax breaks, to people because it has to go to the government and the government pays for things that help people, right? So that might be a thing that I believe. And I might say it's important to pay your taxes, but then I might, hire somebody to do my taxes who does a few like illegal things here and there just to save me a couple $100 on my return, right? So I'm saying that I believe that taxes are important and everybody should do them, but I'm also saying, or I'm also doing a behavior that says, well, everybody should pay taxes, but I don't want to pay the full amount of taxes that I owe, right? So there's some dissonance there. And so I might say, well, the I pay so much in taxes already, so I don't need to contribute any more than I already do, right? So I'm justifying this conflict between my beliefs and my behaviors. Then we have persuasion. So persuasion is basically how we get people to be on our side on some topic. So let's say I finally watched the Sonic the Hedgehog movie, and I wanted to convince you to watch it. I could just show you the trailer, right? Or I can say, this movie is one of the greatest movies that I've ever seen. Please sit down. This is going to take 20 minutes. I'm going to break it down for you, right? Two different ways of persuading someone. The peripheral route is basically quick and dirty, right? That's your movie trailer. You're convincing somebody to do something without like really breaking down all the reasons why. Or you could do the central route, which is that slow, methodical method, which convinces others by breaking everything down, right? I could convince you not to smoke by just grabbing one of those like dark smoky lungs that you might have seen growing up, or a picture of it, and just say, this is what's going to happen if you keep on smoking. Or I can have like an hour-long conversation with you about like the different negative effects on your health, central route versus peripheral route, right? Depending on the situation, one might be more right than the other, but central is slow and methodical, peripheral quick and dirty. So then we have social influence, which you might have experienced, because I assume that maybe at some point you were part of a group project or some group activity, right? So social facilitation is when the actions of members in a group influence other members of a group to also start engaging in that action. So let's say maybe you live with a few other people, and Saturday morning you get up and start cleaning, right? And then everyone who you live with also starts helping out with the cleaning. That would be a form of social facilitation, right? Your actions caused other people to act, which then in turn led to other people acting. What some of you might have experienced, especially if you've done a group project, is something called social loafing, right? So you have five people to do this group project, and one person just isn't responding to text messages or phone calls or emails. And the one time that they were supposed to be in class, they were not. So you decide to take it on your shoulders to do part of the project. Now, and then you say, well, I'm going to do your part, and then they, don't do their part, and then you do their part. And then what ends up happening is they learn that they don't have to exert effort to still get the same grade. Because if everybody's getting the same grade, they might be incentivized to not work as hard. So sometimes what happens in social loafing is that the group will start working, the group will pick up the slack of the people who don't, and the people who are slacking off will go, well, I don't need to work as hard because there's actually no consequence for me not working. If that sounded familiar and triggered you a little bit, I'm very sorry. So finally, let us talk about some experiments in social psychology. The first is Milgram's study, which is a study on obedience, which just basically asks, if somebody asked you to do something, somebody with authority, how likely are you to do it? This was inspired by what we saw in Nazi Germany, where German soldiers were killing people in mass because the that's what they were told to do, right? Would you stand up against authority and do the right thing? We all say that we would, but the studies showed us that we likely wouldn't. So they got a whole bunch of average people from their town for this study, or from like the local area for this study, and they basically introduced the person to another person who was supposed to be the learner. They would be tied up to a machine that would give them a shock of increasing voltage every time they got the answer wrong. The person who was pulled in to the study would be the one who shocked them. So you can see the person getting strapped in right here, right? and these two people are people who were pulled into the study, right? So they increase the voltage more and more, and even to the point where the person stopped responding. So the person had been screaming in pain, and then they stopped responding. Now, luckily for us, this person is what's called a Confederate. They were pretending to actually be shocked. They were actually separated by a wall, so this man could only hear the guy on the right. So the but the question or this study showed that people, when given the chance, can do horrible things, even if they don't think that they would. The simple presence of an authority figure telling you to go on will make you do terrible things. So that's a really great example of social psychology, because we were understanding the power of social dynamics on our behavior. Then we have the Stanford Prison Experiment. So for the Stanford Prison Experiment, they got some college kids, so people around your age. By the way, this is a shot from the movie. These are from the actual experiment. So they did make movie recreations of what happened. They are very interesting to watch. Milgram's experiment, the Stanford Prison Experiment. If you have time, check them out. The So what ended up happening was Professor Philip Zimbardo, asked for students to come join this experiment. Half were assigned to be guards, half were assigned to be prisoners, and it was supposed to be, I believe, a 2-week study, but it was stopped after the 5th day. Why did it get stopped? Well, the purpose was to see how people changed in a jail setting, how the prisoners adapted to being prisoners, how the guards adapted to being guards. They embrace the authority. And if you've learned nothing about social psychology, you will be surprised to know that they 100% did, to the degree that, and again, reminder, these are fellow college students, right? They're the same age. They were randomly assigned to being in the two groups. And what ended up happening was the guards started to be very physically and emotionally abusive to the prisoners. Never like actually laying hands on them, but making them like lay in a bed that had like nettles in it, taking away their beds, and only leaving a bucket for pee and poop. So the we saw very quickly how out of control it got, which showed us how powerful the roles that we are given are, right? The power can go to our heads, or that loss of power can really affect us negatively. So that's the Stanford Prison Experiment. Last but not least, the case of Kitty Genovese. So let's say you right now heard from outside someone screaming for help. What would you do? Would you call the police? Right? Would you look outside to make sure that they were okay? Now, some of us might say we would call the cops, but I'm going to tell you right now that you are very unlikely to do so. The reason for this is what's called bystander apathy. Now, we learned about this from the very unfortunate case of Kitty Genovese, in which she was being stalked by a man who was following after her, who stabbed her multiple times out of her car. She fought him off. He came back. He followed her up to her apartment and stabbed her a few times on the stairway. Meanwhile, she was screaming for help, and no one called the police. The reason for this is very unfortunate. The more people who appear to know that something is happening, the less likely you are to do something. So let's say You're driving down the road, and the road is completely empty, and you see a car that swerves off the road and crashes into a tree, right? You see that, and you immediately go, "Oh crap! I should do something about that," right? You pull over, you ask if they're okay, you call the police, right? And that's what you are would be expected to do as a good citizen, because if you don't call, who else is going to call? You're the only one on that road. Now, let's say this happened on the 210, right? You're driving along, then you see a car uh, start to lose control, and then you hear the screeching as it uh, swerves and goes and runs into the uh, divider, right? Now, because you saw it, but you're aware that hundreds of other drivers have also seen it, you'll probably move out of the way and then drive around it, right? So the more people that are aware of something, the less likely we are to actually help. And that's very important to know, because in many ways, the fact that we live in a society means that we have the capacity to help each other. But sometimes we have to be the ones to actually reach out and help. Otherwise, people will die. That is a very dark note to end on. Oh boy. Um, Well, can't think of anything uplifting. Just go watch some videos of cute animals and we'll be good to go. Okay, take care. Have a good one.